And the president says the oil prices will drop rapidly when the destruction of the Iran nuclear threat is over. It's a small price to pay for the United States and the world for safety and peace.
So, Brian, you did a phone interview with the president of the United States. What is his read on this?
So I asked him, how do you get the prices down? I know how much you care about oil and gas. And he says, tell these tankers to get to it. We've wiped out most of their launchers. Here's exactly what he said. These ships should go through the Strait of Hormuz and show some guts. There's nothing to be afraid of. They have no navy. We sunk all their ships.
Hello, dear listeners, friends, comrades, subjects, citizens, insurgents, fugitives, defectors, dissidents, even the haters and losers. Welcome to Turbulence. My name is Dylan Saba, and I'm here with my co-host Seamus Malek-Afzeli, along with our producer M. Siniza. We're recording from New York City, the center of a world empire that is dying, but so far from dead.
We are currently a little over 2 weeks out from the beginning of the American-Israeli war against Iran. The communications from the White House are, of course, emphasizing that there are still clear objectives that the United States and its partners are pursuing against the Islamic Republic, but in actuality, there seems to be just a total disparation of aims and objectives in which, according to Lindsey Graham, they're going to try to eliminate nuclear program after the war in some manner or another. Israeli officials are now saying behind closed doors that the fall of the Islamic Republic might not even happen until after the war ceases. And right now, all of the efforts of America seem to be focused on reopening the Strait of Hormuz, despite the fact that Trump himself has said that 100%, literally he said 100% of Iran's military capabilities have been destroyed, except for a few drones. But also Strait of Hormuz is so thoroughly closed that a multinational coalition should go in there and reopen the strait, including China. Is that a good summary of where we are?
Yeah, I think really this war has all become about the price of oil and about the Strait of Hormuz. Iran has very predictably realized that their leverage over the United States is their leverage over the global economy. And their geographic strategic location right next to the Strait of Hormuz, through which 20% of the world's oil passes and a third of the world's fertilizer passes. The fact that the United States didn't anticipate this consequence is a kind of glaring question in terms of U.S. strategy leading into this war. But you're absolutely right. That is where things stand at the moment. Donald Trump has resorted to taking to Truth Social to beg China to send a naval escort along with the multinational coalition. This is at the same time that the U.S.'s force posture in East Asia is rapidly shifting as it's redeploying its missile defense system from South Korea, from the Republic of Korea, to the Middle East. So unclear what China's interest would be in helping the U.S. break this impasse at this moment. We've also seen the U.S. and its energy coalition partners release 400 million barrels of oil from its strategic reserve. And meanwhile, there doesn't seem to be much in the way of a military strategy against Iran. There has been some discussion of...
I'm sorry. I couldn't. I looked up the Truth Social post announcing this, and it's so immediately clear what he is trying to do by getting all these different countries. Like he just says, it's easy for them to send a drone or two, drop a mine, or deliver a close range missile somewhere along or in this waterway, no matter how badly defeated they are. Next sentence. Hopefully, China, France, Japan, South Korea, the UK, and others that are affected by this artificial constraint will send ships to the area so that the Hormuz Strait will no longer be a threat by a nation that has been totally decapitated. Like, The mission is so clear. America is way too tied up here. They do not want a situation in which American soldiers are put in danger again. So everybody else send their ships and also get sunk to the bottom of the ocean and be enraptured in this whole quagmire. Do it for us.
Right. And he can't help but give away the leverage that Iran has, right? He's like trying to use the one move in his arsenal, which is power projection and just being big and scary as a madman and say, we're going to blow you all to hell if you don't do what we're demanding, but also at the same time revealing his biggest weakness, which is the economic weakness. And so, yeah, it's like this message that's supposed to be intimidating. And it's like, hopefully China sends some help. And one way or the other, we're going to get it open, we swear.
The pump and dump stuff with the oil prices, it keeps repeating over and over. I'm noticing that it's maybe losing a bit of steam. They can't do it forever, but they still are trying. I think the energy secretary said that in a few weeks, the price will go down. Yeah. Still, we're still way down from U.S. Navy ships that have escorted oil tankers through the Strait, so that's covered. Or they're going to soon do it, but still the U.S. Navy isn't actually agreeing to any of this. I mean, even in a few weeks, even if, as they say, this war will end in a few weeks, which I'm still skeptical of, I'll be honest with you, in what way would that immediately lead to stability in the way that they're describing? I'm not certain of that.
Well, I mean, the key question, right, is who ends. What does it mean for the war to end, right? Because the U.S. and Israel can declare that their military objectives have been satisfied, which is appears to be what the market is expecting, or what people who are talking about Trump always chickens out, are anticipating is going to happen here, is that he's somehow going to back down. But what that fails to recognize is that even if the U.S. and Israel decide that they want the war to end, it actually has to end with some kind of agreement, some kind of arrangement with Iran. And what Iran is saying right now is the conditions for the reopening of the Strait is the U.S.'s full military withdrawal from the Gulf, right? So it is not a question of when does Trump decide that the U.S. and Israel are done with this war, but what can they actually do to reopen the Strait? Are they willing to actually give Iran what it is demanding here? And I think that is what is the most telling component of all of this, is that this is no longer really a conflict about military power or strategy, which is evident in the fact that all of the White House's messaging, as you're indicating, is about oil. He has the energy secretary going out and speaking to the nation to calm the markets. Where are the military people? Where is Marco Rubio? Where is anyone explaining to the American people what the military strategy for this war is? The only thing that we're getting is graphics from the White House talking about the number of ordinances that are dropped. Nothing about any kind of strategic objectives. Just we've bombed the shit out of them. And it's like, okay, well, I don't think anyone is surprised by that. But that is not a metric to getting to any kind of political off-ramp. And so the war has shifted into a posture where the entire U.S. public relations campaign around it is to manage the economic consequences for this Pandora's box that they've opened and now have no idea how to close.
What was interesting to me was that because this becomes so much about oil prices, now the goal that is being advertised to the American people is that once Iran is neutralized as a threat, oil prices will, like, long-term be much more stable because Iran can no longer use this point of leverage, which we instigated.
Yes, right.
They weren't doing it before. The whole thing, if you do this, we'll do that.
I think as long as it lives in the level of rhetoric and messaging, that's going to work. But the consequences from this war are going to arrive, and they're going to arrive a lot quicker than people think. So obviously, it's going to start with gas prices, and those have already started to tick up, and that is going to continue to go up. And, Trump loves to focus on gas prices. I don't think he will be doing that anymore, but people will feel it in their pocketbook. But moreover, the broader economic consequences of this war are going to start to rebound on the American consumer over the next several weeks, months, and through the rest of this year. And I think over time, that's going to be harder and harder for the Trump administration to sell. And I am very curious to see what will happen to the MAGA coalition when the price of the burger goes up to like $40.
Something that I'm wondering about, because I did look up the current gas prices. We're recording this intro on Sunday, March 15th, and right now the average gas price is $3.70, which is up from a month ago when it was $2.93. I'm going to make a prediction that it's going to continue to go up over the next 2 days when this episode goes out. Something that I'm interested in, which might happen in the next couple of days. I'm hoping that it doesn't and that people come to their senses about this. But there seems to be this talk, especially from Trump world and Lindsey Graham himself, about landing Marines on Khark Island to seize the oil infrastructure there. Because they made a point when they bombarded all the military infrastructure there, what they said was military infrastructure there, that they were going to leave the oil infrastructure alone. That's what Trump said. The obvious implication being that we're going to take that for ourselves. That's going to be the payment, like it was for Venezuela and then Syria and all these different places. Now, during the Iran-Iraq war, Khark was also bombarded and was under a lot of pressure, so they moved that oil infrastructure elsewhere. It's not fully planted in this place. It would obviously cause a significant disruption to the Iranian economy if this was seized. But this is what it's about now.
Yeah.
Not freedom, not ballistic missile production, not the Iranian Navy, not any of that bullshit. Yeah. Purely about we need to land Marines. Something like they're sending thousands of Marines right now as an expeditionary force to the Gulf. Maybe for that kind of operation, maybe for some other kind of operation, purely to regulate gas prices.
Yeah.
You have never seen something this blatantly about oil. Like all of that rhetoric, all of that hemming and hawing about Iraq being fought for oil, it was never this blatant.
And also never this fucking stupid. There's a lot of things that are stupid about this. One is that they are sending Marines into harm's way, as it were, because, regardless of what Trump says, Iran has continued to fire ballistic missiles, and they've also continued to fire a large number of drones. And so the U.S. is exposing itself to casualties to the extent that it is sending ground troops to Iran. But on the other hand, too, if this is all about control over the oil market, Iran has been very clear and said, if you target our oil infrastructure, we will hit back in kind. And there are a lot of soft targets all across the Gulf that Iran has not yet hit. It has demonstrated its willingness to escalate against ports, against oil facilities in various places in the Gulf. But there is a lot that it has not touched yet. And so the calculation on the Iranian side is, okay, yes, you can deal some pain to us on an economic level, and we will continue to inflict that pain 10x on the global economy. And so the bluster from the Americans is relatively empty, because not only is it the case that, yes, Iran has other avenues for exporting oil. So, just targeting this one export facility would not collapse the Iranian economy as such. Also, Iran as an exporter of oil, if the price of oil is going way up, then they are still collecting a lot of oil revenue because they are able to get their oil out, as they've demonstrated. So we're just in this situation where the U.S. is threatening escalation, and it is not actually gaining strategic leverage by doing so because of the control that Iran has over the oil economy more broadly. And just like a final reminder at that point is that the Houthis are still in waiting.
I would say, just to update people, Mohammed al-Bughaiti, the Houthi movement spokesman, was on Al Mayadeen the other night and said this, quote, regarding the decision to stand alongside Iran, this decision has been made, and we are monitoring the situation with our finger on the trigger, as Sayyid al-Houthi stated. Therefore, Yemen's participation is a matter of time, unquote. So that decision has been made.
Yeah.
We were in the realm of speculation. Sure, it hasn't happened yet, but clearly they are waiting here. They just said so.
I don't see this wrapping up anytime soon. I don't see the U.S. strategy on keeping a lid on the oil prices as being effective. And we are going further down the road of this becoming a military, strategic, political quagmire for the United States.
In terms of recognizing that failure, I would also say to people that you may not even see on your television networks what the kind of negative effects going forward are. This is from Brendan Carr, who is the commissioner of the FCC, in regards to news that Trump was complaining about, that planes at Prince Sultan Air Base in Saudi Arabia had been hit by Iranian munitions. Quote, broadcasters that are running hoaxes and news distortions, also known as fake news, have a chance now to correct course before their license renewals come up. The law is clear. Broadcasters must operate in the public interest and they will lose their licenses if they do not, unquote. Any sort of hole in the invincibility of the United States, they do not want broadcast at all. They are going to manufacture that invincibility for as long as they possibly can.
Yep. Now, we have spent a lot of time on this program covering the what of this war. And that's largely been in our bonus episodes and will continue. The what, the negotiations leading up to the war, the strategic approaches of the belligerents, the US, Israel, Iran, etc., the economic and the geopolitical fallout. But we've spent less time with perhaps the more glaring questions of why. Why did the US start this war, or at the very least, allow it to start? Was it because it was duped by Israel? And if so, what does that say about the US-Israel relationship? Was it to benefit US oil producers? Did Trump just genuinely believe he could pull this off without consequences? These questions all get at the structure of the US empire in its contemporary forms.
So for many years, leaders within the axis of resistance espoused the view that Israel was simply a proxy of US power. This was shared by Hassan Nasrallah. This was shared by Khamenei. It was even shared by Khomeini himself. They were all cognizant of what the nature of the US-Israel power relationship would be. They were not of the opinion that Israel controlled the United States and its actions.
And that is a view that I shared up until about midway through 2024. And because I held that view, I expected at some point that the US would restrain Israel. And I expected that because I thought that they had an interest in preventing this crisis, this broader crisis post-October 7th, from cascading into a regional war that the US was not prepared for and would seriously imperil its interests in the region. I think, in fact, many people in Israel held this view and were on some level waiting for the restraint to come down from the United States. But the view was mistaken. The US effectively gave Israel a carte blanche. And given Israel's shift to a permanent war footing, what has resulted is less of an imperial power proxy relationship and more of what increasingly resembles a murder-suicide pact.
When I wrote in Equator magazine a couple weeks ago, I formulated this as a feedback loop. Gideon Samet, the liberal Israeli journalist, spoke about the Israelization of America, not in the sense that Israel controlled the United States, but that America now looked at Israel as something that was more American than America, and that it should follow the foreign policy objectives that Israel, having been given so much impunity by America, was now following. So America looked to that impunity and wanted it for themselves, and then Israel saw the legitimization of that and then went even further, creating that loop that has now put us in this position where we are fighting a war that every other administration prior to this one looked at as, frankly, impossible, and for good reason.
So to get into all of these questions, we have invited onto the show Professor Darryl Li. Darryl Li is a legal scholar and an anthropologist at the University of Chicago, and a really brilliant guy and one of my favorite interlocutors on these questions. He is a man of many expertises and many talents, and we are very grateful to have him with us today.
Before we get into the conversation, we do have a pitch to you, the listener. Turbulence is entirely listener-funded. We don't run ads. We don't take money from institutions. And that independence is the foundation of this project. It only exists because of you.
Because we're committed to providing you the in-depth history and present context you need to make sense of each of these topics, these episodes take a great deal of time and effort to produce, from conception to research to editing. It's because we value your time as a listener, and because we want to produce something lasting and useful, that we think this level of effort is worth investing in. But that means we can't quite move as nimbly as we might otherwise like. So in addition to our free public episodes, we're also dropping weekly episodes behind the paywall. That's where we'll be able to respond to events as they unfold in closer to real time, providing our analysis, following up on threads and conversations from prior episodes, and drawing connections across the topics we've covered.
To do all this, we need your support. A $5 monthly subscription will give you access to the bonus feed, our Substack community, and most importantly, you'll make it possible for us to keep doing this work independently week after week. Subscribe today at turbulencepod.substack.com and follow along on Twitter and Instagram at turbulence_pod. We hope you'll join us.
Hello and welcome. Today we have the absolute pleasure of being joined by Professor Darryl Li. Darryl is an anthropologist and legal scholar at the University of Chicago and the author of The Universal Enemy, Jihad, Empire, and the Challenge of Solidarity. Darryl and I actually have a funny relationship in that I know him originally from my work at Palestine Legal, where we have collaborated on a couple of different initiatives. But fortunately for you, Seamus, and all our dear listeners, we are both wearing different hats in this conversation, and we will not be discussing the minutia of Title VI of the Federal Civil Rights Act of 1964, as we have much...
I could go toe-to-toe with you people on that.
I'm sure you could, Seamus, but we do have much juicier topics to get into. In any case, Darryl, welcome to Turbulence. We are so glad to have you.
Yeah, great to be with you guys. Thanks.
Darryl, you have had a fascinating personal and professional trajectory that has taken you all over the world. I was wondering and hoping if you could just start by walking us through your journey a bit to help us understand the key questions that animate your work.
Oh my God. Well, I mean, I'm just a pretty typical kid.
I'm just a regular guy.
I'm a kid of the Hart-Celler Act, right? So the wave of post-1965 Asian migration to the United States, I'm a completely typical member of that generation, right? So my parents are Chinese, but grew up in Taiwan. Their families were essentially camp followers of Chiang Kai-shek in the Chinese Nationalist Party. You know, as under that umbrella of Cold War anti-communism, came to the United States to study. I was born and raised predominantly white suburbia. So I'm a, meritocratic hoop jumper, right? So, got into all the right schools, all that stuff. But my life took a turn when I became involved in Palestine solidarity organizing as I was leaving college. And then I had the enormous privilege of living in the Gaza Strip in my early 20s. And I really mean that as privilege because, of course, many Palestinians even then could not go to Gaza, right? So I don't take that lightly. And that was also when 9/11 happened. So I was in Gaza when 9/11 happened and, was in that kind of human rights NGO world and quickly realized that people in that world didn't have an analytical vocabulary or social contextual knowledge to challenge a lot of these new practices we were seeing, especially detention in Guantanamo, because we didn't really know how to think about or talk about different kinds of migration in different parts of the Muslim world. So I transitioned to academia, but I still had commitments to various kinds of activism, which is why I also continued law school. So my political commitments have primarily been about Palestine, but then of course you can't really talk about Palestine without also talking about American imperialism, and especially if you are situated in the United States. So that's why I ended up doing that. But then the scholarship, the kind of day job academia work is really thinking about all of these questions around terrorism, insurgency, foreign fighters, jihadism, and just the basic idea of why it is that sometimes when a person travels from one country to another country, but not as part of a state army and does fighting, why that's seen as so incredibly heroic in some situations and so incredibly problematic in other situations. That's been one of the animating questions in the scholarship. But, otherwise, I'm just like all of us trying to make sense of the situation that we've been in and kind of the various collapses and reconfigurations of both U.S. imperialism and also the sort of liberal order that we've been living under or pretending to live under for some time.
I just have a quick biographical follow-up. Were you in the Gaza Strip New Year's 2000?
No, I arrived in 2001.
Oh, okay, cool. I was just wondering because I was there visiting family at that time as a young child, and I was wondering if we had any overlap.
That's amazing. Where are they living?
In Gaza City.
Where in Gaza City?
In Zaytun.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
And they were there until, I think, early May or late April 2024.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah.
At another point, and not on this podcast, I'll tell you about the time I met Sheikh Ahmed Yassin.
Wow.
Whoa! What?
We're gonna put that behind the paywall.
Yeah, no, I don't know. I don't think that's even right. Because I've also met.
Wow.
How are you meeting these people? Oh my God! What? I have so many questions.
I just, right place, right time. It's more like, how am I meeting people and haven't been punished for it? And a lot of that is just race. Like, I just feel like being Asian, you kind of just get away with a lot of shit. It's really funny. Okay, this is definitely not going in the podcast, but that is the truth.
Okay, Darryl, you and I had a public conversation in the weeks after October 7th, where I described to you that what had happened felt like an earthquake, that overwhelming tectonic forces had shifted the ground beneath our feet in irreversible, but also in unpredictable ways. And to this day, I am still unable to think beyond that metaphor, hence the title of this show. But at the time, you said two things that really stuck with me. One was that we didn't know what structures would survive and what would be totally leveled and what would have their foundations busted up in this earthquake. And then the second thing you said was that it felt like a possible death rattle of the system. This is a quote: "There's a way in which these structures have been shaken by the earthquake, and the little gnomes of empire are running around trying to patch them up here and there, trying to reassure each other and the powers that be that we still got this." With 2.5 years of crisis between then and now, what is your read? What is shattered? What has endured? And does it still feel to you like a possible death rattle?
Wow. So first of all, that was a really generative conversation for me. I feel like almost everything I've written over the past 2.5 years kind of started off as something we talked about. But the other thing that I want to remind you of is that the metaphor for me is not earthquake, it's deluge, right? And that's literal. Al-Aqsa flood, I think, is not a great translation for Tufan al-Aqsa, right? Tufan, is a deluge. It's a storm that animates water, right? I mean, the word, it's in the Quran. It also has etymological resonances with, typhoon, for example. It doesn't come from that, but there's these interesting parallelisms. And yeah, this is Sinwar's world, and we're still living in it, for better and for worse in so many ways. So that cute line about the little gnomes of empire, that was really about Biden. Right. The Trump world is different. It's not little gnomes running around trying to patch things up. It's people who are also taking a hammer to what's there and trying to remake things in their own image. And of course, the sort of, hilariously inept way that the Trump people do things, but terrifying nonetheless. Is it a death rattle? I don't think I was wrong. I mean, it's really tough because you can say that American imperialism is awful, evil thing, and that's certainly true. But it doesn't mean that its death or its decline is, there will be a lot of winners and losers. Let's just put it that way. And it will depend a lot on who you are and where you sit. So I think that's the process that we are seeing. Absolutely. The war is certainly accelerating. Which war? The current phase of the war, the aggression on Iran, that part, I'm not the only one to say it all. And you guys have said this too. And many other people are saying this. The New York Times is saying it, that there is an acceleration in the dissolution of the order that was propping things up for the past few decades. Side note, it is really interesting. I have a running clock in my head about the gap between left analyses of things and when they get kind of begrudgingly verified by the New York Times. And in the case of this war, it's very fast.
Yeah.
It's basically a week. The panic of the elites is palpable in the mainstream discourse, right? That's real. And, it doesn't mean everything's going to work out in a great way necessarily, but it's real. They did not expect this, which is hilarious because how could they not have expected it? But that's the kind of leadership that we're dealing with.
It's funny you talk about the New York Times clock because that is a concept that has lived in my mind and in my household for many years. I remember just as a moody left-wing high school and college student, I would, spout my crank theories of the world at the dinner table. And I would be laughed away essentially. And then I always claimed it was 4 months later it would appear in the New York Times and then I would get my revenge. But you're right. The window seems to be really rapidly shrinking. But go ahead, Seamus.
I mean, if we're talking about just changing perceptions, something that I think was very common in liberal circles or left circles before October 7th was this idea that the relationship between Israel and the United States would be, it's transactional, essentially. That one day being hitched to Tel Aviv would become so arduous, it would become so not worth it fundamentally, that America, if it was under more of a liberal presidency, it would just abandon it. And that really has not happened. If anything, it's just solidified in many bipartisan ways. But something that I'm curious about your perspective is, where do you fall on the line of, is Israel the one who is guiding American policy at this point, controlling American policy, if you want to go that far? Or are we still firmly in the Nasrallah framework, that America is still the one who controls Israeli actions? They are still the ultimate approver, checker, all these different things, that relationship still has not changed. That is still what is the case.
Yeah, wow. You guys are opening up with the hardest questions and the biggest questions. And is the tail wagging the dog or the dog wagging the tail, right? So look, my inclination is more in what you call the Nasrallah camp, right? But I think there are some limitations. I think that we have to account for the sheer depth of emotional investment in Zionism across the American elite space. And I don't think that's reducible to geopolitics or geopolitical interest. Very, very clear example. You can say whatever you want about the Gulf regimes in the United States as a public figure, as an academic, as a journalist, and basically you might be ignored or you might be agreed with. It just won't matter, right? And those relationships are of fundamental geostrategic importance for the United States. That kind of space obviously does not exist for Zionism, right? The other problem with that analysis, I think, is that, if you say that Israel is a colony of the United States, if you're making that point to emphasize that whatever horrible things Israel does, the United States ultimately bears political and moral responsibility, I think I agree with that 100%, right? But as an analytical framing, it's funny because it's like, you're not saying Israel's autonomy or room for maneuver vis-a-vis the United States is the same as, Panama, right? Or even the Saudis, right? So, you still have to have a theory for what the relationship is, right? You still have to account for the relative autonomy that's there. And, on the other side, obviously, the whole, what people can kind of derisively call the Zog theory, right? That basically the United States is lumbering, well-intentioned, and the Israelis are hijacking, obviously that's...
I think the PC term is the lobby thesis.
Yeah, sorry, the lobby thesis, right? There's a version of it that is anti-Semitic. There's a not so anti-Semitic version of it that I think, again, just launders the fundamental problems of the American project, right? So obviously I'm not into that at all, but understand why it holds some appeal, because I think a pure geopolitical or political economic analysis that doesn't take into account things like race, right? It doesn't take into account the transnational character of Zionism. That's really important. So I think part of what we need to remind ourselves of is that it's not really a relationship between one state called the United States and another state called the State of Israel, right? I think of it more as like a relationship between Western imperialism as a set of social forces that condensed into different state forms to organize themselves, that on the one hand, and Zionism as a transnational movement on the other hand. And Zionism, one pole of Zionism is the state form that it takes, right? The entity in the Eastern Mediterranean, aka the State of Israel. But then Zionism also attempts to organize and weaponize diasporic existence, right? Because we have to remember that the first idea of Zionism is that all Jews in the world are part of one nation, the Jewish people, right? And then to say, okay, well, they deserve a state, and that state happens to be Israel, basically. So that's why it's a settler state, why any person who Israeli law recognizes as a Jew, right, using their own blood quantum theory that's not about kind of Jewish ritual law, anyone can just show up and enjoy automatic citizenship, right? Or the fact that the JNF, the Jewish National Fund, and the World Zionist Organization have legal authority under Israeli law to do things like manage land. And these are bodies that claim to represent the Jewish people all over the world, not just the Jews of Israel, right? So the diaspora, I think, is an extremely important part of the Zionist project, right? So it's not the case that Zionism wants all Jews in the world just move to Israel and forget about everything else. Like that would actually be a disaster for Israel, right? What they want is for people to move to Israel and to have commitments to Israel, but also to maintain their commitments elsewhere, to have the best of both worlds, right? To be able to circulate back and forth, because that's also part of how the project will sustain itself. And I think that maybe gets lost a little bit in, some of these bigger arguments, because it requires thinking about the political economy of race and racialization in the United States, as well as racialization under imperialism. And actually, those two things are not the same, right?
Yeah.
Racism inside the United States and racism outside the United States, they're not the same. They're connected. Most people are more comfortable talking about one or the other. And I think we need to merge both. Israel is based on an explicit legal regime of Jewish supremacy. That is not the case in the United States. If anything, anti-Semitism is growing in the United States. But it is the case that in post-civil rights United States racial order, Jews of European origin have had an exceptional space where they're both racialized as white, but also can access the language of minoritized grievance. Right. And that's how they police like people of color with like anti-Semitism claims, whatever. So Jewish exceptionalism and Jewish supremacy are two different things. Right. But Zionism is what allows those things to be connected, because part of what allowed American Jews to have that position in the American racial grammar was the 1967 war. Right. 1967 war demonstrates Israel's indispensability to the United States. It allows the geostrategic relationship to solidify. When that happens, then all of the anti-Semitic dual loyalty stuff that Jews used to have to deal with, that goes away because there's no reason for it to exist strategically, right? And that's where, instead of saying like, okay, Jews have to be careful not to seem too loyal to Israel, the idea is Israel and the United States have the same interests. So therefore, if you are an American Jew who is committed to Zionism, you are actually like a super citizen of both countries. You embody that relationship. And that's why, for example, the fact that there's Israelis captured in Tufan al-Aqsa on October 7th, who are also soldiers in the Israeli military, is completely normalized in American public discourse. Right? Biden can be like, oh, the hostages, but some of those hostages are American, and some of those hostages are actually soldiers, and like that's just complete. Everyone's totally okay with that, right? Now, I don't mean that in like a Tucker Carlson sense. Oh, they're disloyal. Like that is totally not where I'm coming from. Where I'm coming from is it's really interesting that there are more American Jews who serve in the Israeli military than in the United States military, and that this country, the United States, celebrates that militarism, instrumentalizes it. Right? That's interesting. And again, speaking as an Asian American, it's super interesting because for us, dual loyalty suspicion is still completely normalized. In fact, I have a funny story about this. Many years ago, when I first was involved in the Guantanamo litigation, I had to get a security clearance. There's like classified evidence, whatever in there. So I had to have an interview with an FBI special agent. And there were two things that he was concerned about. One is that, in my previous life, I had worked for some human rights NGOs, including Human Rights Watch. I'm sorry, people can just being very, I was young, I was 23, I didn't know, whatever. So I knew, but I didn't. Anyway, so point is, as part of that work, I'd done a lot of work on Gaza, and I had meetings with senior Israeli military officials, like advocacy meetings where we go in and like talk about our report and our recommendations, and they like laugh at us, right? So like I actually had one of these meetings with I was like kind of like Ken Roth's, like little briefing assistant. These are the hilarious things that happen. Anyway, so the FBI guy was really concerned about my contacts with the Tzahal, the Israeli military, right? Because for them, Israel is a significant counterintelligence concern. And actually, you've probably met people in the U.S., like rank and file people in the military and intelligence communities who just fucking hate Israel, right? Because they're just like, they take our stuff, they're not good allies, all that stuff, whatever. The other thing that he was concerned about was the fact that my dad was born in mainland China, even though he moved to Taiwan when he was 3 years old or something, as part of an anti-communist diaspora, right? Because they were with, as I was saying, they were with the KMT. So those were the two things that my security clearance file was flagged for, not the fact that I was doing research with people involved in transnational jihad and had interviewed members of Al-Qaeda, right?
It was Israel and Taiwan.
Yeah. They were like, I was like, that like, I mean, I didn't tell them all these things, but I'm like, I like interviewed bin Laden's bodyguard. I've been in these like, but like the racialization of this is so funny. Right. And I was like, well, I kind of was careful with my language, but I was like, I also am doing this research with like transnational militancy movements. I mean, it's not my preferred language, but that's how I present it. And he was like, oh yeah, that's fine. That's your First Amendment right. But really, I want to know about
you don't have a First Amendment right to being Asian.
Yeah, I mean, like your dad is like a CPC sleeper agent or something, So anyway, but all that to say is, this is why we need to think about the geopolitics of racialization, right? So a lot of the American race discourses kind of don't need to deal with the geopolitics because there isn't like a clear geopolitical threat or analog when it comes to many other racialized communities in the United States, right? It's like the United States oppresses Black people. They don't care what Africa thinks about it. It's irrelevant for them, right? The closest thing was like apartheid and like solidarity links. Even that solidarity between African Americans and Black South Africans had to be constructed, right? It's altogether different from the way that Asian Americans are assumed to have a kind of like national tie and loyalty to their countries of origin, which is not crazy, right? But it exists in a way that's very, very different from how Jewishness is racialized in the United States after 1967.
Yeah.
All those debates about lobby thesis versus aircraft carrier thesis are not really capturing how these different regimes of racialization are working together.
Yeah. And I think that, you're introducing two concepts. One is the political economy of racialization, and then the other is geopolitical contingency and how those relationships have shifted. And it strikes me that a settler colonialism analysis can help intervene in or help re-inject some of those considerations in thinking about why the U.S.-Israel relationship is what it is. I'm thinking in particular of Argyri Emanuel, who argues that colonialists, as in the colonizers and not the metropole, are fighting a reactionary struggle on two fronts. On the one hand is against the natives in the occupied territories. And then on the other is against the great capitalists back home. Yeah. And this strikes me as a more dialectical and more contingent account of either of the poles in this debate, that there is this alignment of interest. That alignment is not structural in that it's determined from the top, but it's structural in that there are these parallel structures at play. And one thing that I think about, and maybe this is like a problematic analogy to draw, but I think of the US-Israel relationship as somewhat similar to the relationship between the Israeli state and Israeli settlers, where you have settlers who are actually engaging in the unlawful version of territorial expansion that are sometimes actually in conflict with the state, in fact, frequently in conflict with the state, but yet nevertheless play this role of getting out in front of the state in a way that the state then goes on to legitimize. And that's kind of how I view the US-Israel relationship of Israel is on a leash, like the dog is on a leash, but then it sometimes slips the leash, but then is releashed in a way that actually fits in the structure of settler colonial expansion. And I don't know if that's like resonant to you, if you think I'm like way out on a limb here.
I mean, there's going to be someone listening to this podcast saying you've compared Israel to a dog and you're an anti-Semite, but like...
I'm Jewish. I'm allowed to say anything. I'm also Palestinian. So.
Yeah. Putting that aside, I think that analogy is there. And I think it's not unique, right? Like the United States of America, its existence is a testament to settler metropole tension, right? Yeah. Rhodesia, South Africa, Australia, this has always been a thing. So this is why we have to think about settler colonialism and imperialism together. Right? Because they're not the same thing. And settler colonialism and capitalism together, which are also not the same thing, right? So Emanuel is really helpful because he is one of the few thinkers that I know of, I'm sure there's others who I don't know of, who is trying to answer this question. And of course, in the 70s, it was real because, you had things like the Northern Rhodesia Unilateral Declaration of Independence. I mean, these people were creating headaches for London, right? And just as the Israelis create headaches for Washington. But headaches are, of course, not the same thing as no longer being on the same political page. They're family disputes. Part of Emanuel's analysis, he's asking, I think, the right question. I think his analysis is a little bit limited because he kind of boils it down to comparative rates of exploitation, right? Like settlers are just more expensive than natives, which is true to a certain extent, but I think it understates the dynamism of evolving forms of capitalism, right? And of course, so, in the case of Israel, it's also, one of the ways in which capitalism really forwards a lot of the patterns of accumulation to the frontier areas that you might not expect because they're also geopolitically vulnerable. Like if you have zones that you do not control, part of how you surround them is by enabling the people next door to get rich, to create a contrast, right? And to build up their own ability to add to the pressure, right? That is why, for example, we have offshore procurement, which is the United States government program that allows Israel uniquely to spend some of the aid that it receives on buying stuff from its own military industry, thereby undercutting American military contractors, right? Israel is the only country that's allowed to do this, except for Taiwan as of like a year ago, which again, same pattern. It's like a standard analysis of like, oh, the military industrial complex is controlling these things doesn't necessarily account for that. So on the one hand, you favor patterns of capital accumulation that are next to zones of resistance or non-control. That's part of how the Gulf gets built up. That's part of how Japan and Korea, whatever, are allowed to build up. But then that's exactly the places where you have vulnerability, right? Which is exactly what we see with the war with Iran right now. So yeah, that is one of the contradictions of the way this particular version of imperialism is working out, that may or may not, my sense is that that was not as much a feature of the kind of late 19th century, early 20th century version of imperialist competition. I mean, the other major thing, of course, is that that was an era of geopolitical competition that was largely internal to the European/white world, right? And still presupposed that the rest of the world was kind of just spectators in this. You know, now we have a very different alignment in terms of geopolitical competition. We are very much uncharted territory. So that's part of why the demise or weakening or reconfiguration of American hegemony, on the one hand, there's a lot of things about it to welcome, but there's a lot of things, there are a lot of unknowns that can also be scary for different people depending on who you are and where you are.
I wanted to know if you could go maybe a bit more in depth about the relationship with the Gulf states, which you had discussed a little bit earlier. Something that I was thinking about was an ad campaign that had happened in 2002 that the Saudi embassy had attempted to do, where they tried to use the same Zionist talking points with Israel that Saudi Arabia had been fighting terrorism alongside the United States for 60-some years. And not a single network, except for, I think, Fox Sports, took it. Yeah. Like, nobody wanted to engage on the same playing field. There was an acknowledgement that Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf states were not on the same playing field. They could be strong allies of the United States. Lindsey Graham keeps talking about a defense pact.
Not anymore. He's now threatening Saudi Arabia, which is amazing.
He goes back and forth, man. I don't know what's going on with him. But like, even so, he has the ability to go back and forth, whereas America, soldiers are willing to die, or commanders, I should say, are willing to die send their soldiers to die for Israel. But the obverse seems to be the case with the Gulf states, in that people are shoving these people to go to war with Iran, but there will be no such American support for that kind of operation. And I'm wondering, what are the reasonings you see for that kind of relationship? Is it just Islamophobia? And because obviously we don't give a shit about human rights abuses. But is it like, how do you see that relationship evolving after this war with Iran ceases, wherever that goes?
I actually think Americans are probably not willing to die for Israel or the Gulf states. I guess we'll see. So before I get to your question, I think the thing we need to take note of is that the argument behind the aircraft carrier thesis, right, was give Israel the guns so that they can police the neighborhood and take the load off of us. And the first time the United States actively put soldiers on the line in support of Israel and lost soldiers was during the intervention in Lebanon in the 80s, when they were covering Israel's withdrawal from Beirut. And that's when you had the bombing of the Marine barracks, hundreds of US soldiers killed. And instead of saying like, oh my God, we need to get revenge and put these people in line, Reagan was like, what are we doing here? F this. And they left, right? And I suspect that if we were in a situation where American soldiers died for Israel, not only would the Tucker Carlsons of the world be ramping up all of their anti-Semitic, theories and what have you, but a lot of the realpolitik people would be like, well, wait a minute, that's not how this works. You're our proxies, right? That's not crazy. The amount of money that it takes for the U.S. to fight, they spent like $11 billion in the first week of war with Iran. That is more than the U.S. gives to Israel in a given year. Right? Because, when the U.S. give Israel weapons, Israel still has to provide people. And people, I think, are still, just as important as weapons when it comes to these things. Now, when it comes to the Gulf states, you have the baseline idea of like, why will there be popular support to help die for other countries in general, right? Then on top of that, you have the absence of the ideological consensus among elites that Zionism enjoys. And then on top of that, you have Islamophobia. So the Gulf states are truly client states in the literal sense. Like, they pay for protection and they don't always get it. The U.S. gives Israel money. The Gulf states give the U.S. money, right, to get their weapons. I think that's a very clear difference. And notwithstanding all of the money they get, they don't buy the level of consent or the level of support. Maybe now with some of the soft power stuff like Dubai chocolate and Real Housewives of Dubai, but that stuff is so fragile compared to generations of Americans, Jewish and non-Jewish, growing up on stories of Exodus, having their emotionally charged experiences with Holocaust Museum things and falling in love with Israel like that. There's no soft power equivalent of that for the Gulf states. None.
No, and they pay for protection ostensibly from the US and from Israel. I mean, really the main wreckers of havoc in the region. And essentially functions as a street tax, right? If you are the threat and you are the protection, then you are a mafia state, essentially. And I think what is notable about this moment is that it is getting knocked out of balance, right? Because the US before this war, they knew this was coming. They knew Israel was going to start it. And what did they do? They emptied their bases so that it would be the Gulf states who are bearing the brunt of Iranian retaliation. And the hope is that it will be the Gulf states who are then dragged in to fight the war on the US's behalf. And what that's looking like is a worse and worse deal from the Gulf states' perspective. It's looking like the actual price of capitulation, which those forces in the region that have taken the very difficult choice of engaging in confrontation and resistance kind of implicitly acknowledge with their decisions. And I think it's a really tricky question of where the Gulf states go after this, because it's not like, from this vantage point, from this posture, there's all that much of an alternative. I mean, there is some discussion of entering into a security umbrella with China, but it's just really not clear whether they live in the region. They live near Israel, and Israel has its own settler colonial ambitions towards expansion and its kind of permanent war footing. So I think that they are reaping the repercussions of their geostrategic choices, but I don't know what it would look like for them to go from here in a different direction, really.
Yeah, and I mean, obviously, I have no insider track on how these regimes think, but I think it is really notable that one of their fundamental ideas is that the GCC states should coordinate, they should stand together because they're small, and that makes sense. But there must be significant tensions because the approaches are different, right? Obviously, Oman has its own approach, but even Kuwait has, for a while been kind of doing its own thing. And of course, we know about the Qatar tensions with the Emirates and whatever. So the effects of the fighting are obviously distributed differentially, right? I would pay a lot of money that I don't have to know what the rulers of Bahrain are thinking right now and about the effects of the war on their own internal political dynamics.
Yeah.
Kuwait also has, traditionally had just a less accommodating line towards Zionism, but they're taking, it sounds like, more damage than some of these other states, and they must be what's going on here? So, the Saudis made some hand-wavy motions a few months ago to a defense agreement with Pakistan, and Pakistan is their reliable, traditional, strategic depth when it comes to military labor. So in the 80s, for example, Pakistan had a brigade deployed in Saudi Arabia to help, quote unquote, protect the holy places during the Iran-Iraq war. And of course, Pakistani officers have long been involved in training and standing up the Saudi military, as well as, throughout the Gulf. But there's no nuclear umbrella, definitely not, right? Because Pakistan has its own relationship with Iran, which is actually, traditionally not terrible, right? They have reasons to keep it to be not terrible. So like you're saying, no clear alternative. And China, I think, has reasons to basically bide its time, and it has relationships with all sides of these things. And yeah.
Yeah. Speaking of China's weighted out strategic posture, I think it's worth talking about the kind of other side of the calculus from the U.S. imperial point of view. So that, there is the approach of, well, let's get the Gulf states to fight this war for us, who's fighting this war for Israel. But there's also the cost to the United States on a real military materiel level.
Yeah.
Just a couple of days ago, it was reported that the United States redeployed its THAAD system, that's the Terminal High Altitude Air Defense Missile Defense System, from the Republic of Korea to the Middle East. And this is presumably because Iran has been seriously degrading the U.S. air defense and radar infrastructure in the region. That THAAD system had been in Korea for a decade to deter the DPRK and to increase the US's force posture in East Asia. And in fact, it was actually pretty controversial when it was brought to Korea. And I think Korea suffered some pretty major costs in terms of its relationship with China as a result of that. So it's very notable that the US is now removing this THAAD system. And some have pointed to this move as an indication that the US is willing, on some level, to dismantle or at the very least scale back its preparations for a future confrontation with China in order to fight this war on Israel's behalf. But others view it differently. Others view it as a kind of staggered initiation of that very conflict, with the US engaging in a strategic sequencing of its enemies. And that's the view that essentially we are already in World War III, that this is the initial stage of the US bringing on that conflict that will ultimately end in a larger confrontation. Do you have a view as between those kind of interpretive lenses for what the US is doing right now?
I mean, I think the latter is a bit too generous in terms of ascribing strategic foresight to the United States, especially to this administration. But it may be objectively not wrong in the sense that that might be eventually how it plays out. That we're going to focus on Iran now and then create a set of circumstances that force us to confront China in a number of years, right? So first thing we should say, of course, is that, the national security establishment has been talking pivot to Asia. I mean, that was an Obama thing, right? And they can't quite do it because they've still assumed the costs of policing this particular part of the world that's so important, but doing so in partnership with an ally that has ambitions that are fundamentally incompatible with the interests of the region, that it will create perpetual conflict, right? So that's kind of an ongoing pattern. I mean, whether they intend it to be a way to tee up war with China, maybe, but that would be crazy because they're so not ready, right? Yeah. But that might be the case. I can't imagine what's his name, Elbridge Colby, the Pentagon policy chief who Trump put in, he's the big we need to focus on China guy. I mean, he got a lot of heat from Republicans for saying at some point something like, well, even if Iran gets a nuclear weapon, it's not the end of the world. Because he's very much about that, right? And but he had to go up in Congress and basically defend the policy that is totally against everything he stood for and saying this war won't go on for that long, right? So, and he's an interesting figure because he's a third or fourth generation national security state asshole. His great-grandfather wrote this article called How to Fight Savage Tribes that I teach in my law of war class. And his grandfather was the head of the CIA during Vietnam, right? So those kind of people, who are really trying to think long-term about the stewardship of the American empire, they have to contend with the fact that the political vehicle that gives them the legitimacy, that gets them those jobs, right, is this right populist thing that Trump is the head of that, actually doesn't necessarily want what they want, right? So they're trying to what's the expression, ride the tiger of that. So I feel those are really the contingencies and the factors that are at work here. But it still may end up looking like we're trying to do this thing in Iran so that we can then draw in China. Because the thing with the United States is when you have so much power, you might be really incompetent, play the game badly, as it were, right? But you can also just flip the table over, knock all the pieces off and still find a way to come out sort of ahead, or at least not having lost all your power. That's the difference between armchair analysis, where you can kind of laugh at how stupid and venal these people are, which of course, there is that, and thinking about it practically of oh shit, I still have to live in the world that is made by their horrible decisions. And we have to face the fact that they could have a catastrophic fuck up and still at the end of the day, find a way to think of themselves as the winner. Right. And sitting with that, I think, is really, that's no fun. That makes it harder to get up in the morning.
I wanted to close out by asking more about this unfortunate world that we're living in. During Gaza, what galvanized so many people? There's this constant need asking for a ceasefire, that being the primary demand of protests against the war. But here, there seems to be more of a complicated picture with the war in Iran, in that obviously people want this war to end, but Iran is not demanding a ceasefire in the same way. They are demanding attritional warfare. They are demanding this to be dragged out further in order to create that deterrent but it's amorphous. It's not a clean reason to extend a war like it was in Iraq, where obviously the point was to overthrow Saddam. And I'm wondering, what effect is that going to have on the anti-imperialist sectors here in the United States, here in the Western world?
Yeah, that is the question. I mean, so much of the political space to oppose U.S. imperialism is constrained and weighed down by the red lines of what's considered acceptable discourse, right? So it's one thing to say like, oh, this is the wrong timing, this is not constitutional, or like even this is against international law, this is aggression. And it's another thing altogether to say something like, well, actually, the only way to keep the United States from continuing to do horrible things around the world is for the United States to suffer some losses. That's a really hard thing for a lot of people to say, right, publicly. How do you organize politically in a place in a serious way that builds power, but that also is able to confront these kinds of truths, right? I mean, these are the dilemmas that socialists in Europe had during World War I, right? Before they eventually, fell into line with nationalism. I don't have a good answer for it, but I think you're absolutely correct to diagnose the dilemma. I mean, we had a dress rehearsal after October 7th, right? Where I was a little bit concerned that like, okay, there has been some positive development and solidarity organizing over the past however many years. And is it going to fall apart because people can't handle the idea of Palestinians resisting? And, that by and large did not happen. I think what happened was there was greater understanding that resistance, armed resistance, you can't be pacifist, right? But the price was by not talking about Islam, basically, right? I think that's sort of how things shook out, for better and for worse. But here, it's a different dilemma because we're talking about people who are directly fighting the United States, right? So I think there is a responsibility on intellectuals to explain why it is that for Iran to stop fighting now is not just not a rational expectation from their point of view, but also sets up the incentives for further aggression in a way that endanger everyone, right? And how do you do that in a way that you don't get smeared as treasonous and whatever? I mean, those I think are downstream issues. Those are tactical issues, right? That's not a question of principle. We have to identify the principle, and then we can figure out what's the most responsible way to educate people about it. But we have to be clear about what the realities are.
And I think one of the challenges or problem spaces to think about this is that the form that much anti-war mobilization has taken over, even in the post-October 7th period, but going back to the Iraq war, is to express a message that the United States should behave well, that we should just stop doing the bad thing. We should stop launching wars of aggression. We should stop brutalizing the global South, etc. And that message failed. And it has failed for, I think, structural reasons. There are structural reasons why the United States will not simply, the powers that be will not simply wake up one day and decide to stop doing imperialism, to stop making the choices that lead to these situations. And so I think the combination of that, a kind of recognition that what will actually prevent the United States from doing the bad action is the costs in different forms to the state, and a recognition that the message of protest, of message delivery protest, is not being received, requires a kind of tactical reorientation on the left. Because there are ways in which we on the left can impose costs on the US war machine that are totally separate from anything that's happening elsewhere in the world, right? A lot of the weapons that are being used to drop bombs on Gaza, drop bombs on Iran, are being produced here. It is fundamentally a different left orientation to, instead of saying, deliver the message that this is bad and must stop, to asking the question, what can we do to make this more costly, to try and stop it where we are? And I think that is the kind of left maturation that I hope to see. And I don't know to what extent it can or will, but that to me is the imperative that we find ourselves in now.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And I think there's nothing like practical goals and challenges to relativize some of the more like intense ideological disputes, right? The ideological disputes are important because you do need like big ideas to animate things. But, if it's If it's grounded in a healthy relationship with actual movement organizing, then it's different, because then the stakes are different. People have to comport themselves differently when they know it's not just shouting at each other at Twitter, that it has consequences for their ability to do things like disrupt bomb production and so on. So yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And I don't know what's going to happen. I mean, I'm pretty scared, to be honest, but it's good that there are people thinking about this and trying to take it in that direction.
Darryl, thank you so much for speaking with us.
Well, thank you guys so much. And yeah, good to talk.